Maria del Pilar Naro Lopez. On February 3, 2009, a retired brigadier general of the Mexican Army named Mauro Enrique Telo Quiñones was kidnapped in Cancun along with his aide, Lieutenant Getulio Cesar Roman Zúñiga, and a family friend. The three men were driven to a stash house, tortured for hours, and killed. It was one of the most brazen attacks on a senior Mexican military figure in recent memory, and it was carried out by a Los Zetas cell operating out of Quintana Roo. When soldiers moved in to break that cell apart, one of the names at the top of their list belonged to a woman in her early 20s who ran what the cartel itself called the female wing of the organization. Her street name was La Comandante Bombón. The person behind that alias was Maria del Pilar Naro Lopez, though the original Sedena Bulletin issued in 2009 recorded her under the name Ashley Naro Lopez. Later federal records and most media coverage settled on Maria del Pilar. Both names refer to the same woman. In the years before her capture, she had climbed into the leadership of a Los Zetas subgroup known as Las Panteras, an all-female cell whose job was not what most people expected from a cartel unit. According to a protected witness identified in court files only as El Pitufo, whose testimony was carried by La Jornada, Las Panteras were trained to approach police officers, soldiers, and municipal officials, cultivate relationships with them, and either bribe them into cooperation or lure them into ambushes if they refused. The witness added that these women were trained to kill. By the time she reached her mid-20s, La Comandante Bombón was leading the women's section of Las Panteras in Nuevo León and coordinating operations across the border corridor. Her cell moved money, moved weapons, and, when the Gulf Cartel needed a certain kind of political leverage, moved information. The general's murder in early 2009 changed everything for the group. General Tello had retired from the Army only weeks earlier and had just been named a public security advisor in Cancun, a city where organized crime had rooted itself deep inside the local police. Whoever ordered the hit knew exactly who he was and what he represented. The federal response was immediate. Within a week, Sedena had traced the safe houses used in the abduction, and on February 9, 2009, a joint military and federal operation moved on a residence in the Residencial Campestre neighborhood of Cancun. That is where they found her. She was arrested alongside Octavio Almanza Morales, known inside Los Zetas as El Gori Cuatro, and the former Cancun chief of police Francisco Velasco Delgado, alias El Vikingo. The tip that led soldiers to that house came from an anonymous caller who identified himself only as Chuy and phoned the 34th Military Zone directly. According to the Sedena press release issued that same week, the raid recovered weapons, communications equipment, tactical vests, and a stockpile of military-exclusive cartridges. There is a detail worth pausing on. She was found in the company of a serving cartel enforcer and the former head of the city's own police force. That is the environment Las Panteras had built. The investigation into her role took a decade to reach its conclusion. Because of the way Mexican federal cases are constructed, she was ultimately not prosecuted for the general's murder itself. Instead, she was charged with organized crime, collaboration to commit drug offenses, weapons stockpiling, and possession of the kind of military ammunition that only shows up when a cell is preparing for a firefight with soldiers. On August 15, 2019, the 2nd District Court for Federal Criminal Proceedings in the state of Nayarit handed down her sentence. 17 years in prison and a fine equivalent to 375 days of income. The FGR communique noted the judgment came after more than a decade of accumulated evidence and testimony from protected witnesses inside Los Zetas itself. There is a persistent temptation in cartel coverage to frame women like her as glamorous exceptions. The nickname Bonbon, which loosely translates as bombshell, plays right into that framing, and the tabloid press ran with it for years. But the operational reality her file describes is far less cinematic. Las Panteras functioned because their targets did not see them coming. A municipal officer being approached at a bar or a family event by an attractive young woman rarely thought he was being scouted. Nobody warned him. By the time he understood the situation, the cartel already had him, or his signature, or his cooperation. In some cases, they had his life. Her arrest did not end Las Panteras. Other women stepped into similar roles across Los Zetas territory in the years that followed, and later inside splinter groups. But it did remove one of the most visible commanders of that early network and confirmed something federal investigators had been arguing for years. The armed wings of Mexico's cartels had never been exclusively male, and treating them that way had been a mistake. Which brings us to a woman who took the same pattern into a very different city and left behind a body count so extreme that even the FBI got involved. Michelle Angelica Pineda Valdez. In February of 2024, agents from the FBI's Safe Streets Gang Task Force in El Paso, Texas, walked into a motel room and arrested a 22-year-old woman who had crossed the border a few weeks earlier. She was carrying firearms, machetes, and a mix of fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and Xanax. She was wanted in Mexico for 5 confirmed homicides and suspected in more than 20 others. Her name was Michelle Angelica Pineda Valdez. On the streets of Ciudad Juarez, she was known as La Cheli, and she led one of the most feared enforcement cells inside the Sinaloa cartel. Chihuahua's Northern Zone attorney, Carlos Salas, would later describe La Cheli as a young woman who grew up surrounded by violence, both inside her home and outside of it. According to his office, her criminal record began when she was 13 years old. By the time she was in her late teens, she had become a member of the Artistas Asesinos, a Juarez-based enforcement arm of the Sinaloa cartel, also referred to as Doble A or Doblados. The cell answered to a jailed leader identified in court records only as Nico, sometimes El Daga, who directed operations from behind bars. Within a few years, La Cheli had risen to become one of the cell's local commanders in the eastern zones of the city. The Artistas Asesinos operated in the parts of Juarez where the Sinaloa cartel had spent more than a decade fighting the remnants of the Juarez cartel and the Barrio Azteca. That war had left the city with one of the highest per capita homicide rates in the world, and Cheli's cell contributed to that number in ways that stood out even in a city numb to cartel violence. Witnesses and court filings described a pattern of extreme brutality. Dismemberments, decapitations, and in several documented cases, the removal of victims' hearts, which were then reportedly placed at Santa Muerte altars. When authorities later searched her residence in Juarez, they reportedly found 2 decomposing human hearts inside plastic bags. And no, I'm not making that up. By late 2023, the cell was under intense pressure. On December 5, 2023, a 23-year-old man named Jorge Renteria Rodriguez was killed in Ciudad Juarez in an operation prosecutors would later attribute directly to La Cheli's group. That homicide would become the central count in the case that eventually convicted her. Within weeks of Renteria's death, the Chihuahua State Attorney General's office issued warrants for her arrest. She did what a lot of cartel operators do when the pressure gets too high. She crossed the border. According to the FBI's El Paso field office, La Cheli entered the United States sometime in early 2024 with the intention of avoiding prosecution in Mexico. Border Report, citing federal sources, said she had come across specifically to evade charges tied to 3 known murders and suspicions of involvement in more than 20 others. She did not stay hidden long. On February 15, 2024, the FBI's Safe Streets Gang Task Force, working with United States Border Patrol, moved on a motel where she was staying and took her into custody. Along with the firearms and drugs, agents recovered the machetes prosecutors would later reference in filings. She was handed back to Mexican authorities at an international bridge and placed in the custody of the Chihuahua State Police. Her case moved through the state's judicial system for nearly 2 years. That is where the story of Lacheli stopped being about one commander in one cell and started being about how a case like this actually gets prosecuted. Chihuahua's Tribunal de Enjuiciamiento del Distrito Judicial Bravos held the trial for the Renteria homicide with Lacheli and several co-defendants in the same proceeding. The prosecution relied on witness testimony, cell records, and the pattern of prior violence attributed to the group. On December 26, 2025, the tribunal returned a guilty verdict. The following day, the court issued its sentence: 50 years in prison for the aggravated homicide of Jorge Renteria Rodriguez. Special agent in charge, Gerard Brown of the FBI's El Paso field office, issued a statement after the sentencing describing the deportation as an operation that had successfully taken a violent assassin off the streets of El Paso and returned her to the hands of Mexican law enforcement to face sentencing for what he called extremely violent atrocities in Mexico. It was an unusually blunt statement from a federal law enforcement office, and it reflected the position of both governments that her prosecution was a priority beyond the single count on which she was convicted. She is now being held at Cerezo Número 3 in Ciudad Juárez, the same prison system whose overcrowded conditions and cartel infiltration have been documented for years by human rights groups. And this is where the 50-year sentence starts to look complicated. Investigators still consider her a suspect in more than 20 additional homicides. Prosecutors in Chihuahua have not ruled out further charges, but the FBI's public position is that the American side of her file is closed. What happens to those other cases will depend on evidence, witnesses, and whether the state prosecutor's office decides to press forward with each one individually. For now, one thing is settled. The 22-year-old who fled to a motel in El Paso in February 2024 will spend her 30s, 40s, 50s, and most likely the rest of her life inside a Mexican federal prison. That is the outcome for a woman who ran a cell for 4 years. The next name on this list ran her own for less than 1, and left behind estimates that made Cheli's numbers look conservative. Melissa Margarita Calderon Ojeda. In September of 2015, investigators from the Baja California Sur State Prosecutor's Office received a piece of information they had been waiting on for months. A young woman was about to board a small charter flight out of Cabo San Lucas, headed for Culiacan, Sinaloa. They knew her name, they knew the flight, they knew which airfield, and when they intercepted her at the gate, they arrested the person one Mexican federal source would later describe as the highest-ranking female commander the Sinaloa cartel had produced in the state. Her name was Melissa Margarita Calderon Ojeda. She went by La China. She was 31 years old. Her family background did not fit the pattern investigators expected. La China was born on August 12, 1984, to parents with no known cartel ties. She entered organized crime in 2005 at the age of 21, moving into a Sinaloa cartel armed wing, then known as Las Fuerzas Especiales de los Damaso. That group was the private enforcement force of Damaso López Núñez, a longtime Sinaloa lieutenant known as El Licenciado, and his son Damaso López Serrano, El Minilik. Within 3 years, she had earned enough trust inside the cell to be named its jefa de sicarios, its head of hitmen, in 2008. At that point, she was in her early 20s and commanding roughly 50 gunmen. Her territory was the tourist corridor of southern Baja California Sur, including La Paz and Los Cabos. Her position inside the Damaso network eventually collapsed. She was demoted in favor of a rival enforcer known as El Grande, and rather than accept the shift, she broke away entirely. Working with a new partner, Pedro Hector Gomez Camarena, alias El Chino, she formed her own splinter faction that she called the Cartel California Sur. The move gave her operational independence. It also removed the protection her old organization had been providing her. The Baja California Sur Press between 2014 and 2015 ran regular coverage of what was happening in the peninsula. Seminario Zeta, an investigative outlet with long experience covering cartel operations in the region, wrote in a 2024 retrospective that although there was no official record maintained by the state prosecutor's office, estimates placed the number of executions attributed to her group during that stretch at a minimum of 150 between late 2014 and mid-2015. Other outlets, including Vice, published lower figures citing more than 133 killings from July of 2014 forward. Some tabloid coverage, including the Daily Mail, ran with the figure of 180, though that number traced back to her ex-boyfriend El Chino, who had cooperated with authorities after his own arrest and had every reason to inflate her body count. That's not a typo, by the way. Every one of those numbers is a journalistic estimate, not a court finding. The single count on which La China was formally convicted involved the aggravated murder of a 54-year-old man named Humberto Juarez Lucero, known locally as Don Maleno. According to the case file, on January 16, 2015, two members of her cell, one identified as El Cumi and La China herself, entered a residence on Bernardo Maldonado Street in the Palo de Santa Rita neighborhood of La Paz. They opened fire on the victim, who died from acute anemia secondary to a gunshot wound. That is the description as it appears in the state prosecutor's official statement. El Chino was arrested in July of 2015, roughly 2 months before she was. He talked. According to statements released to the press by the PGJE, he disclosed the location of what investigators referred to as the group's cementerios secretos, the clandestine graves where the Cartel California Sur had been burying its victims. He also disclosed her travel plans. That is how, on September 19th and 20th of 2015, state investigators knew exactly which flight she would try to leave on. She was taken into custody without incident. Her federal case moved slowly through the Mexican system. She was initially transferred to a federal women's prison in Morelos in 2016, then returned to La Paz on an amparo, a constitutional protection ruling that allowed her to remain closer to the jurisdiction of her original charges. Her formal sentencing did not come until nearly a decade after her arrest. On May 3, 2024, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder of Don Maleno. She is currently held at the Centro Penitenciario de La Paz. The gap between the one count she was convicted of and the estimates of 150 killings attributed to her group is the part of her file that generates the most debate. Investigators in Baja California Sur have said publicly on more than one occasion that they believe the true number is much higher than what the courts have proven. But belief is not evidence, and Mexican prosecutors have to build each homicide case individually. In her case, the informants and cooperators who came forward were themselves indicted or fugitives, and much of what they said could not be corroborated in a way that would survive a trial. That is why the sentence stands where it does. For roughly 7 months in early 2015, a woman in her early 30s ran what state investigators described as one of the most active kill teams operating anywhere in Mexico. She was 31 when they put her on the plane back to La Paz. She may still be the highest-ranking woman the Sinaloa system ever produced in Baja California Sur. The next commander on this list never held that kind of rank, ran her cell for a fraction of the time, and still confessed to 20 murders. Maria Guadalupe Jimenez Lopez. In May of 2012, a joint operation between the Nuevo León State Investigative Police and municipal officers in the Monterrey metropolitan area pulled over an unregistered van. Inside were 3 men and 4 women. One of those women, a 26-year-old widow, was the reason the operation had happened at all. She had been a Los Zetas cell leader in the Guadalupe and Juarez municipalities on the eastern edge of the city. She controlled 14 drug sale points across the metro area, and within days of her arrest, she would confess to being the material author of 20 homicides. She was known on the streets as La Tosca. Her real name is reported in 2 versions, both attributed to the same person. Nuevo León security officials and outlets like HuffPost identified her at the time of her arrest as Maria Guadalupe Jimenez Lopez. Other sources, including Notimex and the Argentine paper Rio Negro, recorded her name as Maria de Jesus Jimenez Lopez. What is not in dispute is her age, 26, her status as a widow, and her role inside Los Zetas. Los Zetas, at that moment, was arguably the most violent cartel operating in Mexico. It had been founded years earlier by defectors from Mexican military special forces units, and by 2012, it was locked in an active war against the Gulf Cartel, its former parent organization, and against government forces along the northeast corridor. Nuevo León was one of the epicenters of that war. Monterrey, the state's capital, had become a battleground. La Tosca's cell was one of the operational arms of that war. Under her command, the group controlled 14 retail drug sale points across the Monterrey metro area and coordinated kidnappings, extortion of local businesses, and car theft. According to the reports filed at the time by Proceso, she also ran surveillance and target selection for the group's sicarios. One of her documented specialties was the identification and blocking of vehicles carrying police, military, or rival cartel members so that gunmen could close in on the target. The reason authorities knew who she was on the day of her arrest was straightforward. Officers had been looking for a stolen vehicle matching the description of the van she was driving. When they pulled the van over on May 1, 2012, they identified her cell members, and the weapons cache the group was transporting. She was taken into custody without a firefight. Her confession came within days of her arrest and was made in the presence of Nuevo León state security officials. Jorge Domene Zambrano, the state's security spokesman at the time, confirmed publicly that she had told investigators she was the material author of 20 homicides. Among those killings, according to her own statement, was the murder of a ministerial police commander named Antonio Montiel Alvarez. She admitted to running the operation that killed him. The Proceso account of that particular murder describes it in detail. Detective Montiel was driving through Guadalupe when a sport utility vehicle pulled in front of his car, blocking his path. La Tosca was inside that SUV. She was the one who cut him off. Once the detective was stopped, gunmen approached his vehicle on foot and opened fire with 9mm rounds. He died at the scene. It was, in her own description, a straightforward execution of a police officer whose investigations had gotten too close to the cell. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. That was the reality inside a Nuevo León police force where, by 2012, cartel infiltration had already been documented at every level. She also confessed that her compensation for running the cell amounted to roughly 10,000 pesos every 2 weeks. At the exchange rate of the time, that came out to about 760 United States dollars bi-weekly. It is a strikingly small figure for someone commanding a network with the reach hers had. It is one of the details that has kept researchers of cartel economics returning to her case for more than a decade. The gap between the operational responsibility she carried and the money she was paid to carry. It says something about the internal economics of Los Zetas and about how the cartel motivated its middle managers. It was not making them wealthy. It was, in many cases, simply making them dependent. The 20 homicides in her confession were never all individually adjudicated in court. That is the reality of Mexican cartel prosecutions, especially during the peak violence years of the Calderón administration. A confession of 20 is not the same as 20 separate convictions, and Mexican courts have long held to that distinction. What she was formally processed on included the homicide of Detective Montiel, participation in organized crime, and weapons and narcotics charges. She has been imprisoned since 2012. Follow-up reporting on her case is thin. After the initial press coverage of her arrest, her confession, and the operations she ran, her name largely dropped out of the news. What is known is that she was held in the state prison system in Nuevo León, and there has been no public reporting suggesting she has since been released or transferred to an amparo status. That silence itself is telling. Nuevo León in the years after 2012 made a concerted push to remove Zeta's cell leadership from operational reach, and the state's most wanted lists from 2013 and 2014 show her name gradually replaced by others. Her cell fractured, the war moved on, and she stayed. If you're getting something out of this so far and you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time to hit that button. It genuinely helps the channel keep putting these deep dives together. Ana Karen Bravo Gutierrez. In March of 2013, the former Secretary of Tourism for the Mexican state of Jalisco walked out of a business meeting in Guadalajara and got into his car. His name was José de Jesús Gallegos Alvarez. Within moments, gunmen from what was then a rising cartel called the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación intercepted his vehicle and killed him. The murder shook the state's political establishment, and when investigators finally worked out how the hit had been coordinated, one of the names that emerged was a 21-year-old woman who had spent 3 days surveilling the former secretary before the shooting. On the streets, she went by La Loca, La Güera, and later, La Chiva Loca. She would come to be described in Mexican media as the first female sicaria of the CJNG. The person authorities were describing was Ana Karen Bravo Gutierrez. In 2013 and 2014, when the CJNG was still consolidating its territory in Jalisco, she had reportedly risen from a street-level hitwoman inside the organization to a coordinator who relayed orders from a senior figure named Ricardo Ruiz Velasco. Ruiz Velasco, known inside the cartel by the aliases Doble R and El Tripa, is now considered a senior member of the CJNG's elite armed unit, Grupo Elite. In the years around the Gallegos murder, he was one of the men Bravo Gutierrez took her instructions from directly. The Gallegos hit itself was, according to the case Mexican prosecutors built, a slow and deliberate operation. Bravo Gutierrez was assigned to serve as the lookout. For 3 days before the murder, she reportedly surveilled the former secretary's movements, tracked his routes, and passed that information to the gunman who would ultimately intercept his vehicle. When they moved on him on March 9, 2013, They knew exactly where he would be. Her name came into the file in part through the confession of a captured associate identified in later reporting as El Tiliche, who cooperated with Jalisco investigators and described her role in the killing. On March 23, 2014, roughly a year after the Gallegos murder, the Jalisco State Prosecutor's Office moved on her. She was arrested at the age of 21. The case appeared, at that moment, to be closed. It was not. In November of 2017, the Mexican outlet Infobae reported that Bravo Gutierrez had obtained an amparo, a Mexican constitutional protection ruling, that invalidated both the arrest warrant against her and the formal indictment. Her defense had alleged that she had been forced to give her statements under torture during the arraigo, the pre-charge detention period that Mexican law allows for organized crime suspects. The judges reviewing the case ordered the Fiscalia to reopen the process with new evidence. What happened after that is where her file goes quiet. There is no public reporting since that ruling that confirms she was rearrested, re-prosecuted, or convicted. There is no public reporting that confirms she was released outright. Her current legal status, more than a decade after her original arrest, is genuinely unknown. What is clear is that authorities have never established, in a court of law that survived appeal, her culpability for the Gallegos killing or for the other homicides Mexican media at the time attributed to her group. For a case that was once treated as a flagship prosecution against the CJNG, that outcome is striking. Her arrest in 2014 was covered as a major victory for the Jalisco State Prosecutor's Office. Her name was included in cartel briefings distributed to federal agencies. She was described in Milenio, Seminario Zeta, and Infobae over the years as one of the first women to hold an operational sicaria role inside the CJNG, at a time when the organization was expanding rapidly across western Mexico. Some of what has been written about her since is difficult to verify. The colorful details about her personal life, her reported nicknames, and her relationships inside the CJNG's leadership have circulated largely through unnamed police sources and cooperator testimony. The core of what can be documented is narrower. She was arrested in connection with the murder of a former state secretary. Her arrest was based partly on the testimony of a cooperating witness. Her constitutional protections were later upheld by a federal judge on the grounds of alleged torture during arraigo. Her case has not, to public knowledge, produced a conviction. What her file illustrates is one of the recurring problems in Mexican cartel prosecutions. The evidence that gets an arrest made is often not the same evidence that survives judicial review. When cooperator testimony collapses, or when detention conditions get thrown out by the courts, cases that looked like sure convictions can dissolve entirely. That is what appears to have happened here. For that reason, Ana Karen Bravo Gutierrez remains one of the more unresolved figures on any list of women who allegedly held enforcement roles inside Mexican cartels. Her alleged role in the murder of a former Jalisco Secretary of Tourism is a matter of public record in the case files. Her personal culpability in the eyes of a Mexican court has never been formally established, and her whereabouts, as of the last credible reporting, are not publicly known. While her story is one where the legal system essentially reset itself, the next name on this list is at the opposite end of that timeline. Her case has barely begun. Karen Juliet Ojeda Rodriguez. In December of 2024, police in the Colombian city of Barranca Bermeja arrested a 22-year-old woman on the street, along with a man and a minor traveling with her. She was carrying a 9mm pistol. Her companion was carrying a revolver. Colombian investigators had been tracking her for months as the alleged second-in-command of a Bucaramanga-based gang, and according to the Policia Magdalena Medio, the person responsible for coordinating and personally executing what they described as the group's most sensitive contract killings. Her street name was La Muñeca, in English, the doll. Karen Juliette Ojeda Rodriguez was born in Barranca Bermeja, in the Colombian department of Santander. According to reporting by the Colombian daily El Colombiano and by regional journalist Jacobo Solano Cerchiaro, whose social media coverage of the case has been picked up by national outlets. She completed her bachillerato and entered organized crime at the age of 18. Within 4 years, Colombian police were describing her as the operational second-in-command of a Santander-based gang known locally as Los de la M. Los de la M is not a household name outside of Colombia. Inside Santander, it is a criminal organization directed from the Giron prison by a jailed leader named John Jairo Fernandez Portal, whose alias is Marihuano. Fernandez Portal is also, according to Colombian police, La Muñeca's romantic partner. Colombian investigators alleged that she visited him in the Giron facility to receive instructions and coordinate the group's operations across Bucaramanga, Piedecuesta, and Barranca Bermeja. Within the group's hierarchy, she was allegedly responsible for the coordination of selective killings, which is the Colombian legal term for targeted assassinations. Colombian officers who briefed reporters after her arrest said she was known for personally executing the operations the group considered its most important, because of what one officer described as her marksmanship with a handgun. The case that ultimately brought her into custody involved a murder on July 23, 2024, in the municipality of Piedecuesta. The victim was a man named Davy Jesus Garcia Palomino, whose street name was Orejas. According to El Colombiano, Garcia Palomino was La Muñeca's former boyfriend, and the killing was allegedly ordered over a dispute involving money owed on a micro-trafficking operation. Colombian prosecutors have alleged that La Muñeca, along with an accomplice known as Paula Valentina Joya Rueda, whose street name is Gorda Sicaria, received the equivalent of 4 million Colombian pesos to locate and follow Garcia Palomino. Once they confirmed his location, 2 men on a motorcycle carried out the killing. Colombian police from the Magdalena Medio Regional Command began building a case against her almost immediately. Investigators established the money trail, the coordination between the accomplices, and the pattern of movement that led Garcia Palomino to the rural spot in Piedecuesta where he was killed. By late November of 2024, the operation to arrest her was already in motion. She was captured on the streets of Barranca Bermeja on December 1st and 2nd of 2024, in what Colombian prosecutors described as a capture in flagrancia, meaning she was taken into custody in the act of criminal activity. Officers recovered a 9mm pistol and a revolver from her and her companions. Alongside her at the time of the arrest were a man identified only by the alias Leopoldo and a minor whose identity has not been made public. The minor's presence as a co-participant rather than a victim is significant because it points to how the group was organized and how it recruited from within its own local circles. Lieutenant Colonel Mauricio Herrera Luengas, the commander of the Policia Magdalena Medio at the time of the arrest, announced the capture publicly and told regional press that the arrests should bring greater tranquility to the region. It was a familiar formulation from a Colombian regional police commander, and one that reflected how tightly the group's operations had been affecting daily life in the surrounding municipalities. La Muñeca was formally charged with aggravated homicide, homicidio agravado in Colombian law, in connection with the killing of Garcia Palomino. A control judge in Santander ordered her placed under pretrial detention in a carceral facility. She did not accept responsibility for the charges. That means her case is now moving through Colombian criminal proceedings as a contested case rather than a plea, and she has not been convicted. That distinction matters. Much of the color that has surrounded her case in Colombian and international media, including the comparisons to the fictional Sicaria characters played by actresses like Maria Fernanda Yepes in adaptations of Jorge Franco's novel Rosario Tijeras, has come from her physical appearance and her age rather than from proven adjudication. The Colombian outlet, Semana, and others have run headlines describing her as one of the most feared sicarias in Colombia. What the case file actually contains at this stage is the alleged coordination of one killing, the possession of illegal firearms at the moment of arrest, and the corroborating testimony of Colombian investigators. Whether the wider allegations that she personally carried out multiple contract killings across 3 Colombian municipalities will be proven in court is a question that will not be answered for some time. Colombian criminal proceedings for cases like hers typically take between 1 and 3 years to move through preliminary hearings, evidence review, and trial. For now, she sits in pre-trial detention, awaiting a legal process that will determine whether Colombian courts confirm what Colombian police have alleged. The next woman on this list did not run a gang, did not command a cell, and did not coordinate anything larger than her own contract. She was hired for a single job, and the 2 men she killed made international headlines. Esperanza Gutierrez Rojano. On July 24, 2019, 2 men sat down for lunch inside a restaurant called Hunan on the top floor of Plaza Arts Pedregal, an upscale shopping center in the south of Mexico City. One was a 41-year-old Israeli citizen named Alon Azoulay. The other was a 44-year-old Israeli citizen named Benjamin Yeshurun Suchi. Suchi had traveled to Mexico under a diplomatic-style cover and was, according to the eventual investigation, doing business with operatives from the CJNG. Neither man walked out. Both were shot at close range at their table by a woman who had been sitting nearby. Her name was Esperanza Gutierrez Rojano. She was 33 years old. She was a mother. And she had been hired for the job for the equivalent of roughly $250 United States dollars. Before her name appeared in a federal criminal file, Esperanza Gutierrez Rojano lived in Tláhuac, one of the 16 boroughs of Mexico City. She had worked as a waitress at a bar reportedly linked to the Tláhuac Cartel, though Mexican investigators did not tie that group to the Plaza Arts killing. Her connection to the CJNG operatives who commissioned the hit came through a chain of intermediaries that federal prosecutors would spend the following 3 years mapping. She should be introduced accurately. Some outlets have referred to her by the alias La Cabo. That alias does not appear in any credible official record. It appears to originate from a line in the newspaper Excelsior that described her as un peligroso cabo suelto, which is an idiomatic Spanish expression meaning a dangerous loose end. The phrase became detached from its context and over time was reported as a nickname. It never was one. A second alleged nickname, Mariana, was used, but only as a covert communications handle in her contacts with a CJNG operative identified as El Vaca in leaked Sedena files. It was not a street name. In breaking coverage in 2019 and in the official bulletins issued by Mexican authorities, she was referred to only as Esperanza N, in accordance with Mexican identification protocols for suspects in criminal proceedings. What she was, according to the case federal prosecutors ultimately built, was a contract shooter. She was not the head of a cell. She was not a coordinator. She had been hired to perform a specific job, and she had performed it. According to statements attributed to her by the Mexico City Investigative Police and reported by El Universal through the outlet Nación 321, she told investigators that she was a gatillera, a trigger woman, and that she had been paid 5,000 pesos to carry out the killings, roughly $250 United States dollars at the exchange rate of the time. The higher figure of 25,000 pesos, which appeared in some coverage attributed to the crime reporter Carlos Jimenez, referenced a total package that reportedly included the forgiveness of a debt on a firearm. The killings themselves occurred inside the Hunan restaurant during the lunch hour. Both Israeli men were shot at close range. A co-shooter fled the building. Esperanza Gutierrez Rojano was intercepted minutes later by Mexico City preventive police officers on Periférico Sur, one of the main peripheral roads that runs around the south of the capital. She was taken into custody without significant resistance. Her prosecution moved faster than most cartel-adjacent cases in Mexico. She agreed to a procedimiento abreviado, a Mexican legal mechanism that allows for expedited sentencing in exchange for admission of guilt. In December of 2022, the Fiscalía Región Sur Poniente in the state of Morelos, which had jurisdiction over the relevant charges, obtained her conviction. According to reporting by Proceso, the sentence was 26 years and 8 months in prison. She was assigned to Chefereso Número 16, the federal women's facility known as CPS Femenil Morelos, in the municipality of Cuautlan del Rio. The broader case did not end with her. The alleged intellectual author of the killings was a woman named Vanessa Ballart Fallas, whose alias was La Guerra. Ballart Fallas was, according to Mexican prosecutors, a financial operator inside the CJNG connected to the cartel's top leader, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho. The theory of the case was that the two Israeli men had been lured to Mexico over what prosecutors alleged was a debt owed by the CJNG to their business associates, a debt reportedly valued at roughly 20 million euros. Ballart Fallas allegedly coordinated the meeting that placed both men at the Plaza Arts that afternoon. On October 11, 2024, however, a Mexican court acquitted Ballart Fallas and ordered her released from custody. President Claudia Sheinbaum publicly criticized the ruling and questioned the strength of the prosecution's evidence in that portion of the case. The acquittal illustrated something uncomfortable about the Plaza Arts file. The shooter had been convicted. The person alleged to have hired the shooter had not. That leaves Esperanza Gutierrez Rojano as the only person currently serving a sentence for a killing that federal Mexican prosecutors described as one of the most brazen public assassinations carried out in Mexico City in the last decade. She was paid the equivalent of roughly 250 United States dollars. She was 33 years old. She was a mother of a small child. And in the space of a lunch service on a Wednesday afternoon in July, she performed a killing that closed off the freedom of two Israeli nationals, generated years of international coverage, and put her in a federal women's prison until she is close to 60 years old. The final name on this list operated on a scale even smaller than that. She never fired a shot. She only had to know where to look and who to point out. Nancy Manriquez Quintanar. In 2011, on the edges of the Estado de Mexico municipality of Ecatepec, a 25-year-old woman named Nancy Manriquez Quintanar was arrested by state police. She had never carried the title of jefa. She had never commanded her own cell. What she had done, according to the case investigators built, was walk into bars and nightclubs in Ecatepec, identify men involved in the low-level drug trade for rival organizations, gather personal details about them, and then hand those men over to a sicario who would kill them. She had been linked to at least 9 murders. Her street name was La Flaca. Before going further, a name has to be untangled. There are 3 different women in Mexican cartel history who have gone by the alias La Flaca, and Mexican tabloids have merged them for more than a decade. The first is Veronica Mireya Moreno Carreon, a former decorated police officer from San Nicolás de los Garza in Nuevo León, who joined Los Zetas and was arrested by the Mexican Marines in 2011. The second is the woman this section is about, Nancy Manriquez Quintanar. The third is Jocelyn Alejandra Niño, a Gulf Cartel figure who briefly became internet famous after images of her posing with an M4 rifle spread across social media, and who was found dismembered in a cooler in Matamoros in April of 2015. She is deceased. The other two are not. When you read about La Flaca in Mexican media, you have to check which one the article is referring to, because they are routinely conflated. The Nancy Manriquez Quintanar version was from Ecatepec, on the outskirts of Mexico City, and her cell operated as a Los Zetas outpost inside the Estado de Mexico. Her documented role was recruitment and targeting. She would frequent bars and nightclubs in Ecatepec that were known meeting places for street-level drug dealers, engage in conversation with the ones her cell had identified as belonging to rival organizations, extract information from them about their operations, their contacts, and their schedules, and then relay that information to a sicario tied to her cell. The sicario would carry out the killing. The case investigators eventually built against her involved multiple homicides connected to that pattern. Reports at the time by Estado de Mexico press placed her involvement at 9 confirmed killings, though other reporting indicated the figure could have been closer to a dozen. The averiguación previa, the Mexican equivalent of a formal investigative file, that was opened by the state prosecutor's office, the PG-GEM, specifically tied her to the murder of 3 people killed outside a bar called Siete de Copas in the Colonia San Agustin in Ecatepec. The specifics of that particular incident, as they appeared in the state prosecutor's summary, followed the pattern her cell had used repeatedly. 3 men were identified as belonging to a rival drug operation. Their movements were tracked. La Flaca reportedly made contact with them at the Siete de Copas and confirmed their identities. A sicario arrived later, outside the bar, and killed them. The pattern was efficient, low visibility, and until she was arrested, extremely difficult to interrupt. Her arrest itself was not a dramatic operation. Estado de Mexico State Police, working from information developed through the earlier arrests of members of her cell, took her into custody in Ecatepec in 2011. Some sources place the date in early 2012. She was 25 years old. She was not carrying weapons at the time of the arrest. She did not resist. What her case illustrates, and what has kept it in the file of researchers studying cartel structures for more than a decade, is how the enforcement operations of groups like Los Zetas actually functioned at the street level. The gunmen tend to attract the coverage, but the operations that killed the largest number of low-level rivals in the Estado de Mexico in that period depended on people like Manriquez Quintanar, whose job was not to fire the weapon, but to make sure the right person was standing in the right place when the sicario arrived. She was, in a sense, the operational link between reconnaissance and violence. She was also, according to the file, extremely good at it. Follow-up reporting on what happened to her after her arrest is limited. What is publicly known is that she was processed through the Estado de Mexico state judicial system and imprisoned. There is no public reporting suggesting she has since been released, and her name does not appear in the amparo dockets that have surfaced other cartel-linked women back into the news. The presumption in Mexican organized crime research, which is not the same thing as confirmation, is that she remains inside the state penitentiary system. She has never appeared in the tabloid press in the way the other 2 women who share her alias did. Veronica Mireya Moreno Carreon became a subject of documentary coverage because of her background as a police officer. Jocelyn Alejandra Niño became a viral figure because of her age, her appearance, and the manner of her death. Nancy Manriquez Quintanar has remained, essentially, a case file. She was arrested, she was prosecuted, and she disappeared into the Estado de Mexico prison system. 9 killings, or possibly a dozen, all of them carried out without her ever having to pull the trigger. That is 8 women from 3 cartels across 2 countries. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.